Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Munro Live. I'm Jordan Arocha. I'll be your host today. I'm Director of Commercial here at Munro Associates. And today we're going to be covering the Cadillac LYRIQ. So we're super excited to get this in. I want to give a quick shout out to Adam and the team at Data Driven for allowing us to get our hands on this vehicle and take a look. So much appreciated. We'll go through several things today, but as we go through this, I really want you to key in on some of the things that we'll talk about because it really matters if you're interested in what Munro does, right? We don't just review vehicles, but in fact, we're looking at key engineering elements within the vehicle, the way that they set up the architecture, the way that they package certain things, some of the materials that they use, and really what we're trying to drive at is, at GM or any OEM for that matter, what are the key items that they really prioritized in terms of structure, lightweighting, cost, performance, right? There's a lot of different things depending on the vehicle application or the OEM that may supersede others. And so to me, that's one of the most interesting things about looking at a vehicle, not just like in knowing how they did something or what have you, but trying to like infer the why they did certain things on a given vehicle architecture, which if you're not familiar, that's largely what Munro does in various aspects for different clients and customers. So as we go from front to rear, the front end of the vehicle, they do have an AGS system that's kind of packaged, tucked up under the grille. It's not a full A-surface AGS system, but it does lead into a dual shot cooling fan and shroud system right here. So you can see this relatively flexible, overmolded, right? So you've got likely a EPDM or a TPV, so like a rubberized material that's shot in the same mold as an injection molded part to seal up against this cooling fan system. The interesting part about this that I might make mention of is, although we've got a dual shot here, what you'll notice is that there's actually no contact between the cooling fan system, like this cooling module, and the shroud. So often, why do you go to a dual shot? Well, you do so from a compliance perspective often, so that you can get that direct interface and so that you can build it, right? So that if things need to move out of the way slightly or you want some compression, but you want to seal out that orifice from an air perspective, you'll do a dual shot. So the interesting thing to me is they don't even make contact. They're likely installed in different subassemblies. So why are we using two different materials on the same part here? They're actually not realizing the benefit necessarily that you would typically observe from doing an overmold like that. So just kind of an interesting note as we look at the vehicle. At the front end of the vehicle and the architecture overall, right, we've got a stamped steel and welded front cradle, right? So it's a full perimeter cradle, meaning it's not open in the front end, right? They actually connect all four sides of the cradle, structurally speaking. And this particular cradle leverages what looks to be a 6-point mounting system. So, and it does look to be hard mounted, right? So they're not isolating the front end of this vehicle relative to the body in white structure. So this cradle is actually going to contribute both from a like kind of a stiffness and bending and modal perspective. It's going to contribute to the structure. As we talk about structure and looking at the front end of this vehicle, we typically make some mention about SORB, so small overlap rigid barrier. It's an impact test that's conducted within 25% of the overall vehicle's width. Those tests are conducted by IIHS. If we look at the corner nodes on this vehicle, what you'll see is, so yes, the cradles come outboard of the center line of the vehicle quite a bit, right? So they've got these welded on structures that interface with a lower bumper beam. But then also what you'll see above that are several monuments on the bumper beam, the primary front end impact and bumper beam above. So this right here, and then that multi-cell, there's those sort of like 4 open fluted voids in that member that's welded to it, as well as another member right here on the cradle. And so all of these together are likely all SORB countermeasures. So what they've done is they've got 1, 2, 3 different tiers just that are observable from the underside here that are all engaging from a structural perspective, from a SORB perspective during that event to distribute the load not just fore aft and cross car, but also in the vertical axes, right? So by what they've done, they're saying they want to engage the front end bumper beam, they want to engage the cradle, and then they are actually engaging another tier to the cradle, or the top of the cradle. So in effect, what they've done is engineered like a two-tiered cradle, which is very atypical to do something to this extent. The only other areas or vehicles that we've seen exhibit sort of like this two-tiered approach are actually back in the half shaft region of the cradle. And so folks like Range Rover and a few others have actually opened up an orifice for those half shafts to be passed through, but they do from a bending perspective to keep that front end of the vehicle and the cradle stiffer in the bending mode, right? As you've got a long moment arm, this whole front end from the dash panel extended outboard. But what GM's done here on the LYRIQ is really do that whole structural box or multiple sections stacked on top of one another. They've created an incredibly structural node at the front end from predominantly what looks to be a Sorb perspective. So that comes at a cost, though. There's absolutely cost incurred, mass incurred by doing something like this, right? To me, this also speaks to the fact that they likely have a little bit of an offensive approach from a Sorb perspective, meaning that they're trying to engage that barrier quickly, get the movement of the vehicle going away from centerline, away from the barrier, right? So the offensive strategy is to kind of deflect from the barrier, not to just kind of take the barrier head on and then pivot once you reach full stack up. So kind of an interesting approach, but definitely some mass and cost incurred in terms of the way that they executed in this particular design. Going just below that, you'll see this is pretty flexible, this is pretty flexible here. Once again, these are some dual shot components, or at least this one is, and then this is just a single shot. But the reason that they're doing this piece and this piece right here, just in front of this wheel envelope, is they're really trying to smoothly dip that air curtain around the wheel envelope so that air doesn't get trapped around the wheel, right? They're trying to reduce drag with all of this to get the air curtain going around the lower control arms here and around the wheel so that it's a much smoother transition as we go underbody and as we go outboard away from the wheel. So, and then the reason that they're doing the dual shot here is so if you pull up to a curb right here, this is going to deflect up and out of the way and not break, right? You can see how it kind of creases up right here in the plastic part versus snapping like just a hard plastic may, okay? As we move a little bit rearward in the vehicle, further rearward here, the front end architecture, so they do have a double virtual ball SLA front suspension. So that's kind of a mouthful, I'm aware of that. But what they've got going on is they have two ball joints on the upper end of their control arm with a long knuckle system. So if you look up here, Eric, what you'll see is where the control arms interface with the knuckle, you'll see two black rubber boots. Inside of those rubber boots are ball joints. As you look at the bottom, I'll kind of point out what an example of that would look like. We have two separate lower control arms, 1, 2, and two ball joints, again, going to the knuckle. So what do you get when you've got, or why do you do two separate ball joints like that on a given control arm, top or bottom? What it does from a geometry perspective is where these two control arms would typically, in a I'll say more simplistic suspension system, tie into one ball joint, what you get by having two is from a geometry perspective, what you're actually doing is you're terminating these geometry lines short. And what the virtual ball does, it says from a load carrying perspective, if you projected those lines outward, wherever those lines actually intersect is actually the center line of this suspension geometry, right? From a wheel contact perspective, right? So you're actually, what they're doing here is they're manipulating from a suspension geometry perspective how and where the pressure and the load is distributed on this tire. And by doing it on both top and bottom, they're able to really manipulate where they want that contact patch to be, and they're going to get some benefits from that in terms of how the vehicle rides, how that vehicle goes into different camber scenarios throughout different jounce and rebound conditions. And so it's definitely a cost add though, right? Typically you only see a suspension system like this on a premium vehicle. So like the LYRIQ, right, catering to that higher price point audience. We saw similar things from like Audi, right, BMW, some specific models will do this, but it's definitely a cost hit. The other thing that I found interesting, way at the top of this front end suspension, is we've seen Hyundai, Kia, Tesla, a few others do this approach for the shock mount, right? So at the very top where that coil spring goes into the body in white structure, you're seeing a die-cast aluminum support structure. And that's doing a couple of things for them. One, it's giving a proper spring seat or reception point for that upper strut to socket into, right? It's really supporting and stabilizing that. And two, it's allowing all of those bolts to come in from the top down and be installed in a fairly simplistic manner. So it's allowing this whole suspension system to deck up in the Z-axis, still giving you that wide footprint, ton of extra structure and stiffness at that upper shock interface to body in white. But once again, it is absolutely a cost add. The thing that I find interesting on their specific application is, unless we actually tore it down and took a look at it, I'm not actually sure what the benefit would be in this particular instance from a design for assembly perspective. The benefit that the assembly line would have in installing this versus a conventional strut where you've got 3 to 4 lugs or studs coming through the top in the shock tower where you're running nuts down. So interesting decision by them, but the double SLA virtual ball is kind of a interesting one to see. I always kind of get excited to see those and then jump behind the wheel and see if you can kind of tell what sort of suspension it is. Interesting exercise. Drive a vehicle without looking at the suspension system, not knowing anything else, and see if you can guess what it is. Probably not. Okay, coming further rearward in the vehicle, we've got the rear of the cradle and leading edge of the whole battery pack. So this whole, this is an E-coat, that's what that kind of green color is. This whole E-coated tub here, this is the bottom of the battery pack structure. Pretty deep battery pack in Z, the vertical axis. And they've got some interesting things going on at these, what we would typically refer to as like the torque box area of the vehicle. Essentially where the cradle, the floor of the body structure, the sills, and the battery pack, all these sort of things nexus and come to a head. What's going on here is that they've got a couple of things. So one is a double shear bracket. We've talked about that in other videos. This double shear bracket is going to provide more joint stiffness where the cradle bolts to the body in white structure versus really only being supported on one or the other side in a conventional setting. By putting this bracket over the top of the cradle and then latching it onto the battery pack, from a joint perspective, it's much stiffer. It doesn't want to matchbox to the same extent or parallelogram. Outboard of that, we've got this piece of foam. That's all it is. It's a very lightweight but fairly high stiffness piece of foam here. And so that's supporting a portion of the back end of the wheel liner, which is like a PET fabric. So typically an NVH benefit to the vehicle doing this PET fabric. The foam, then the cradle coming into these, right? They all kind of wrap around this foam piece. And then you've got an open cell area at the leading edge of the battery pack. So where I'm pointing at right here, you'll see some windows opened up on the bottom of the battery pack, and there's truly just an air gap, a void between where the batteries actually go and this whole area. The reason for this likely is they're trying to get more free crush space and more structure also, right? You have to, it's the perfect harmony of free crush space and structure that make an impact script work. So it appears, looking at this, either they're being very conservative and or they did not have enough energy absorption by the time of the impact event to get back here, where they needed to open up more structure at the leading edge of the battery pack before you actually get into the batteries themselves. So that's why these windows are likely here. That's why you're seeing kind of this void in the whole battery pack and the foam right here. And another kind of key witness point of that is right here. You're seeing another stamped bracket that's not going through E-coat. So this is a trim chassis final or a final assembly added item that's bolting into there, bolting into the body in white structure. So a lot of reinforcements, a lot of triangulation given the orientation of the cradle, the body in white structure, where that wheel would kind of stack up against this torque box area. Kind of a lot of stuff coming together here. But overall, what I'm seeing so far in the LYRIQ is a fair bit of cost added to this vehicle overall, right? And mass, right? There's a lot of steel, there's a lot of brackets, frankly, but they're obviously quite focused on that whole SORB countermeasure thing. Looking at the underside, so like kind of dead center here, you'll notice, okay, so what is this orange cable going to? This is a EAC compressor. So it's electrified air conditioning compressor. So this is part of your thermal management system. Very interesting placement. Not very typical to place one of the EAC compressor monuments underbody like this. So they've got a cast aluminum bracket that's isolated, right? So you don't get all those vibration modes going back to the cabin, and it's placed underbody. Since the vehicle that we have is only rear-wheel drive, I'd be very, very curious to see in an all-wheel drive version what they're doing in terms of placement of this EAC and what that does to the whole packaging script. Because frankly, what I'm seeing under hood here, or underbody rather, is that there's not a lot of room to package what's here from the underside looking up. So if you know, we looked at an all-wheel drive version, I think that would be quite a tight package. Okay. All right, why don't we head back to the rear end of the vehicle here. So one of the first things that stood out to me when I looked at the rear end of the vehicle is this guy, this little rectangular section right here. This is the plate cooler for the rear EDM. And the reason that it stood out is because of its sheer size. This is one of the larger plate coolers I've ever seen bolted directly to a drive module, right? So what this does is on one side, you're gonna have coolant going to it or through it. And then on the other side of it, you're going to have oil, more than likely, right? So they're doing a heat exchange with two different liquid mediums going in the same exchanger. The odd part about this, and I won't be able to confirm for you today necessarily, but I've got a good inclination given some of the other components around it, is what's odd is they don't have ports for coolant going directly to the outside of the plate cooler. Ordinarily speaking, you've got brazed on ports right onto the plate cooler where you're interfacing ethylene glycol, these coolant lines right here directly into it. In the LYRIQ's case, they've got ethylene glycol lines, sure, but they're going directly into the casting of this housing right here. And the other kind of interesting part is the distance or the span from that one to the other one. So I'd be very interested to see, right? So there's one ethylene glycol line here, another one coming in from the top. I'd be very interested to see what they're doing to get ample coolant flow internally, like via machined galleys or otherwise, how they're getting coolant to go into this plate cooler to do that heat exchange. And then moreover, I think given the form factor, the size of the plate exchanger, I'm curious if they're trying to leverage that additional surface area to help from a heat rejection perspective with the inverter, or they've got a more drastic cooling requirement for the motor, for example. Just kind of an interesting thing. The EDM overall, I would say, is quite large in the x-axis, meaning fore, aft, and vehicle, right? Kind of how they've positioned this whole thing. It seems to span quite a bit. So typically that's indicative of a offset gearbox, meaning the center line of the half shafts or the axle, like the EDM overall output, is going to be offset from the motor, right? So the rotor and stator. So that typically yields a larger package fore aft or in the Z-axis vertically than a coaxial. So this does look like an offset system. Looking at the rear suspension overall, so similar to the front, they've got a stamped steel and welded rear cradle. They've got a multi-link rear suspension, which is quite tightly packaged, and I'll explain why I'm saying that in a moment. But in terms of cost versus the front, it's much, much more cost efficient just from a sheer material selection perspective. So if you harken back to what we saw in the front, The front was like all either forged or die-cast aluminum components, knuckle included, the casting to support the spring, all the control arms. Here, it's quite the opposite. We're seeing, you know, single-sided, like stamped C-section links, and we're seeing, you know, very simple, you know, kind of multi-link separate spring and shock absorber setup, where that spring is just going right onto a body in white monument above it. Not a lot going on here in the way of exotic materials necessarily, but still incredibly functional, right? Like as a driver, you would probably have no idea whatsoever if you just took these materials and swapped them out from steel to aluminum or vice versa. It's really not going to register to the driver unless you do them back to back and there's a major mass impact, right? Like if you, all this unsprung mass, meaning not carried by the springs, but outboard of that, if you had a massive weight hit or reduction, then you could possibly feel some of that feedback depending on how the suspension was damped. So overall, not too expensive. The cradle, again, very large sections, a lot of welding, right? I'll say a very beefy, for lack of a technical term, but a very large cross sections, very stiff rear cradle. But in contrast to the front, where we had a hard-mounted cradle, the rear, much like most of the battery electric vehicles that we look at, uses an isolated rear cradle, meaning they have an elastomeric mount in between, in an isolated manner, the cradle and the body in white, right? So that's a rubber piece that sits just above that disc. And so what that's going to really help with is all of the NVH translation and transmission from this drive unit, the motor, the gearbox, all those winding noises going into the cabin. It's really going to keep all of that stuff at bay, more so than if you were to do a hard-mounted rear cradle everywhere else. So relatively run-of-the-mill in terms of the isolation. Above this, okay. It looks like, based on what I'm feeling here, well, it's hard to say. No, they just have a stamped steel rear tub. So, I mean, they're obviously focused on the NVH of the vehicle quite a bit. They've got this PET NVH shield in the back. They've got PET fibrous wheel liners, right? So it is a premium application, right? They are really trying to make this quiet for the customer. They don't want to have the same wind noise concerns or issues that, you know, Tesla has obviously been known for. But again, every one of those things is added cost to the vehicle. So, I mean, they will absolutely be, you know, in some of these meetings where we're deciding how much MVH, how many mass dampers, et cetera, you know, there's hard decisions and discussions surrounding, do we put it in, don't we put it in? Is the juice really worth the squeeze for the customer? I think the last thing that I wanted to point out here that kind of sticks out like a sore thumb, especially once I say it, are these cables. Right, so if you look at these two incredibly thick and large cables here, you might start to wonder what in the world are those doing there? Well, those, based on what I'm seeing, are actually isolating this rear EDM. There's no, these are not orange, these are not high voltage, these are not going from the motor to the inverter, the battery, nothing like that, but rather these are just grounding straps. I can't say in a competitive example or execution have I ever seen grounding cables quite that large. I'd be very, very curious to know what is the specific mode or rationale that they would cite for putting these in here. Again, these are very, very costly. The abrasion wrap, the separate brackets, frankly, kind of the torturous path to get from here, right? I mean, this may be 8 inches or so, and yet they have, I would say, you know, almost 2 feet worth of cable to get from here to here, you know, to wrap around some of the mounts for the aero shield. So just kind of an odd thing, frankly, to see not to see a grounding strap, that's very conventional, but to see one of this size is very intriguing to me. So all in all, kind of cool to finally get under this thing and take a look at it. I want to tear one down soon, right? Because obviously we're just sort of skimming the surface of what's on this vehicle, but hopefully you enjoyed the walkthrough. And if you've got any further questions about what Munro does or how we might be able to help you out, go ahead and reach out to sales@leandesign.com. Thank you. Thank you so much.